The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Linda clutched her daughter's hand in the emergency room waiting area, watching the clock tick past midnight. Sarah's breathing had become shallow, her lips tinged blue at the edges, and still no one had called her name. 3 hours they'd been sitting there. 3 hours while Sarah's chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty. 3 hours while nurses walked past with clipboards and sympathetic glances, but no solutions. When Linda finally stood to demand help, the receptionist didn't even look up from her computer screen. "Ma'am, I've told you, we're triaging based on severity. Your daughter will be seen when a bed opens up." But Linda had seen the empty gurney wheeled past 15 minutes ago, had watched 2 people with minor injuries get called back before them, and she knew something was terribly, impossibly wrong. The question that would haunt her forever formed in that moment. What if the system deciding who deserved care had already decided Sarah didn't matter? If you want to see how this medical nightmare unfolds and why it should terrify every single one of us, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will change how you see hospitals forever. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Linda clutched her daughter's hand in the emergency room waiting area, watching the clock tick past midnight. Sarah's breathing had become shallow, her lips tinged blue at the edges, and still no one had called her name. 3 hours they'd been sitting there. 3 hours while Sarah's chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty. 3 hours while nurses walked past with clipboards and sympathetic glances, but no solutions. When Linda finally stood to demand help, the receptionist didn't even look up from her computer screen. "Ma'am, I've told you, we're triaging based on severity. Your daughter will be seen when a bed opens up." But Linda had seen the empty gurney wheeled past 15 minutes ago, had watched 2 people with minor injuries get called back before them, and she knew something was terribly, impossibly wrong. The question that would haunt her forever formed in that moment. What if the system deciding who deserved care had already decided Sarah didn't matter? If you want to see how this medical nightmare unfolds and why it should terrify every single one of us, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next will change how you see hospitals forever. Sarah had been fine that morning. A college sophomore home for spring break. She'd complained of chest tightness during breakfast. Nothing alarming, just discomfort she attributed to stress from finals. By noon, the tightness had become pain. By 3 in the afternoon, Linda was driving 70 miles per hour down the highway, her daughter gasping in the passenger seat, begging her to hurry. They'd arrived at St. Catherine's Medical Center at 9 in the evening, and Linda had run inside carrying Sarah's insurance card like a golden ticket, certain that help was moments away. The intake nurse had asked questions in a monotone voice, typing answers into a computer that seemed more important than the 19-year-old girl struggling to breathe 3 feet away. History of heart disease? No. Current medications? None. Insurance provider? Linda had answered everything, signed everything, done everything right. So why were they still sitting here while Sarah's skin took on the translucent quality of wax paper? Linda watched a man with a bandaged hand get called back. She watched an elderly woman with a cough disappear through the double doors. She watched the clock count down the minutes of her daughter's life, while the receptionist answered phone calls and updated spreadsheets. The waiting room smelled of old coffee and fear, a scent Linda would never forget. The smell of powerlessness fermenting in recycled air. Sarah leaned against her shoulder, each breath a conscious effort, and whispered words that made Linda's blood freeze. "Mom, I can't feel my fingers anymore." Linda shot to her feet, knocking over the plastic chair, and this time she didn't ask politely. She grabbed the receptionist's desk with both hands and leaned in until their faces were inches apart. "My daughter cannot feel her extremities. That means her circulation is failing. That means she needs help right now. Not in 10 minutes. Not when you feel like it. Right now." The receptionist's expression didn't change, but her eyes flicked to her computer screen. then back to Linda with something that looked almost like pity. "Mrs. Bennett, your daughter's case has been assessed by our triage algorithm. She's classified as non-urgent based on her vital signs and medical history." Linda felt the words land like punches. "Non-urgent? Look at her! She can barely breathe." The receptionist lowered her voice, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "The system flags patients based on multiple factors: insurance coverage, pre-existing conditions, likelihood of positive outcome. It's not my decision." Something in those words made Linda's stomach drop. A free-fall sensation that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with understanding something she wished she didn't. She turned and walked back to the intake desk, the one where she'd filled out the initial paperwork, and picked up the clipboard that still sat there with her copies. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages, searching for what she'd signed without reading carefully, what she'd agreed to in her panic to get Sarah help. There it was, buried in paragraph 7 of page 3, printed in 8-point font beneath sections about liability and consent. By signing below, you acknowledge that treatment priority may be determined by proprietary assessment algorithms that evaluate multiple factors, including, but not limited to, medical necessity, resource availability, and institutional risk management protocols. Linda read it 3 times, each pass making her more certain that these words meant something monstrous. Resource availability, risk management. What did Sarah's life have to do with risk management? She looked up and found a nurse watching her from across the room. A young woman with dark circles under her eyes and a name tag that read, Jessica. Their eyes met, and Jessica's expression confirmed what Linda was beginning to understand. Something was very wrong with how this hospital decided who lived and died. Jessica glanced at the receptionist, then back to Linda, and mouthed 2 words that Linda couldn't quite make out. Before Linda could ask her to repeat them, Jessica turned and disappeared through the staff door, leaving Linda standing there with a clipboard full of signatures and a daughter who was running out of time. What had Jessica been trying to tell her? Sarah made a sound then, a wet, rattling gasp that pulled Linda back to the chair beside her. Her daughter's eyes had gone unfocused, staring at something beyond the waiting room walls, beyond the fluorescent lights, beyond her mother's desperate face. Linda wrapped her arms around Sarah and felt the fragile birdcage of her ribs working too hard, felt her daughter's heart hammering against the prison of flesh and bone that was betraying her. "I'm getting you help," Linda promised, though she had no idea how to make that promise real. She looked around the waiting room at the other patients, wondering if they knew, wondering if they'd all been assessed by the same algorithm, all reduced to numbers that determined their worth, wondering which of them had been deemed worth saving, and which had been marked for death by computer code. The double doors swung open, and a doctor emerged, scanning the room with the practiced indifference of someone who'd learned not to see people as people. His eyes passed over Linda and Sarah without pausing, without recognition, without mercy. And then a nurse appeared beside him, the same Jessica who'd been watching Linda earlier, and she leaned close to whisper something in his ear. Whatever she said made his expression change, made him look directly at Sarah for the first time, made him take a step forward, then stop, his face transforming from concern to something else entirely. Something that looked like fear. He pulled Jessica aside and spoke in a voice too low for Linda to hear. But she saw Jessica's face go pale, saw her shake her head, saw the doctor grab her arm and say something sharp enough to make the young nurse flinch. And then they both turned and walked away, leaving Linda and Sarah exactly where they'd been for the past 3 hours, alone in a room full of people. Dying in a place meant to save lives. But now Jessica appeared at Linda's side, moving quickly, urgency crackling around her like static electricity. "Mrs. Bennett," she whispered, crouching down so her face was level with Linda's. "Your daughter's file has been flagged." "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Linda shook her head, her throat too tight for words. Jessica glanced over her shoulder, then continued in a voice barely louder than breath. The algorithm marked her as high risk for malpractice litigation. Something in her medical history, or your family's history, I don't know. But when patients get flagged like that, the hospital delays treatment to avoid liability. They're waiting for... She stopped abruptly, her eyes going wide. The receptionist was standing now, staring directly at them, one hand reaching for the phone on her desk. Jessica stood quickly and walked away without finishing her sentence, without explaining what the hospital was waiting for, without giving Linda the information she needed to save her daughter's life. Linda's mind raced through every medical form she'd ever filled out, every doctor's visit, every insurance claim. What could possibly have flagged Sarah as a malpractice risk? Her daughter had been healthy her entire life. Nothing more serious than a broken arm in 4th grade, and the usual childhood illnesses, unless it wasn't about Sarah at all, unless it was about Linda. 3 years ago, Linda's mother had died in a hospital, complications from a routine surgery that shouldn't have killed her. Linda had asked questions, demanded answers, consulted with a lawyer who'd ultimately told her there wasn't enough evidence for a case. But she'd filed a formal complaint with the state medical board. She'd written letters. She'd made herself a problem. And now, apparently, she was in a database somewhere, marked as someone who asked too many questions. And her daughter was paying the price. The realization hit her with the force of physical violence. They were punishing Sarah for Linda's refusal to stay quiet about her mother's death. The hospital wasn't incompetent. They were deliberately withholding care, letting Sarah suffer, maybe letting her die, because some algorithm had decided the Bennett family was too much trouble. Linda looked down at her daughter, at the blue tint spreading from her lips to her cheeks, and felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart. Something harder than her heart. Some fundamental belief in the fairness of the world, in the sanctity of hospitals, in the promise that doctors kept when they swore to do no harm. She stood up, her legs steady now, her hands no longer shaking. If they thought she was trouble before, they had no idea what trouble looked like. She walked straight past the receptionist, past the authorized personnel only sign, and pushed through the double doors into the emergency room. The hallway beyond was controlled chaos, nurses moving between curtained bays, monitors beeping in overlapping rhythms, the smell of blood and disinfectant mixing into something that stung the back of Linda's throat. A security guard appeared immediately, a heavy man with tired eyes who'd done this 1,000 times before. "Ma'am, you can't be back here." Linda didn't slow down. "My daughter is dying in your waiting room. I'm not leaving without help." The guard reached for her arm, and Linda spun to face him, her voice loud enough to carry over the ambient noise, loud enough for every nurse and doctor in earshot to hear. St. Catherine's is using an algorithm to deny treatment to patients flagged as litigation risks. My 19-year-old daughter has been sitting out there for 3 hours with respiratory failure because I filed a complaint 3 years ago. Is that the kind of hospital you want to work for? The hallway went quiet. Not silent. The machines kept beeping, but the human sounds stopped. Nurses froze mid-step. A doctor turned around, his hand still on a curtain. And in that moment of collective held breath, Linda saw something flicker across multiple faces. Recognition. They knew. Maybe not all of them. Maybe not the specifics. But they knew something was wrong with how the hospital operated. Something that made them look away from patients like Sarah. Something that let algorithms override their medical judgment. The security guard's grip loosened on her arm. "What room is your daughter's file in?" he asked quietly. Linda blinked, thrown by the question. "She doesn't have a room. She's still in the waiting area." The guard's jaw tightened. "No, ma'am. Every patient who comes through triage gets a file in the system. She has a room number, even if she's not in it yet." He pulled out a radio, spoke a series of codes Linda didn't understand, then looked at her with something approaching anger. "Room 247. It's been empty for 4 hours." 4 hours? Sarah had been categorized, assigned a room, and then left to deteriorate in the waiting area while her designated bed sat empty. Linda felt her vision narrow, the edges going dark, and she realized this wasn't just negligence or bureaucratic inefficiency. This was a choice. Someone had made the conscious decision to let her daughter suffer. The security guard was already moving, speaking into his radio again, and suddenly there was motion everywhere. Nurses appearing with a gurney, someone running toward the waiting room, and Linda following them back through the double doors to find Sarah slumped sideways in the plastic chair, her eyes closed, her chest barely moving. "Sarah!" Linda's voice cracked as the nurses lifted her daughter onto the gurney, as they started moving fast down the hallway. As monitors were wheeled alongside and oxygen masks appeared, and someone was shouting medical terminology Linda couldn't process. She ran beside the gurney, holding Sarah's hand, watching her daughter's face for signs of consciousness. They burst through doors into room 247, and the space erupted with controlled urgency. Nurses moving in practiced synchronization, someone cutting away Sarah's shirt, another establishing an IV line. A doctor Linda hadn't seen before barking orders while checking Sarah's vitals. Pulse ox at 78%. Blood pressure crashing. Get me an ABG and chest X-ray stat. The doctor's hands moved over Sarah's body with clinical precision, but his face was grim. He looked up at Linda, and she saw the question in his eyes before he asked it. "How long has she been hypoxic?" Linda's voice came out as a whisper. Her lips started turning blue about 2 hours ago. The doctor's expression went carefully blank, the professional mask sliding into place to hide whatever he was thinking. 2 hours of hypoxia. Okay, we're going to do everything we can. Everything we can. The words sounded like a disclaimer, like the beginning of an apology for failure that hadn't happened yet, but was already inevitable. Linda watched them work on Sarah, watched the monitors show numbers she didn't understand but knew were bad, watched her daughter's chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance, and felt the floor tilting beneath her feet. A woman in a navy suit appeared in the doorway, her presence immediately shifting the room's energy. The nurses glanced at her, and then away, their movements becoming more careful, more documented. The doctor straightened slightly, his shoulders tensing. The woman's name tag identified her as Patricia Henderson, Risk Management Director. Of course they'd sent risk management. Patricia's voice was professionally sympathetic, the tone of someone who'd practiced delivering bad news. "Mrs. Bennett, I understand you're upset. I want you to know that we're investigating what happened in triage tonight, and we take these concerns very seriously." Linda stared at her, at this woman in her expensive suit with her carefully modulated voice, standing in front of the daughter she'd left to die. "You're not investigating anything. You knew. Your algorithm flagged my daughter, your staff followed the protocol, and now she's—" Linda's voice broke. Sarah's monitor was making a sound it hadn't made before, a sustained tone that made every person in the room move faster, work harder, speak more urgently. "She's coding. Get the crash cart!" The doctor's hands were on Sarah's chest now, compressing in steady rhythm, while a nurse squeezed an oxygen bag and another prepared medications, and Linda was being pushed backward, out of the way, away from her daughter who was dying right in front of her. Patricia's hand was on Linda's arm, pulling her toward the door, and Linda tried to resist, but her legs wouldn't cooperate, her body betraying her the way the hospital had betrayed Sarah. They moved into the hallway, and Patricia was saying something about procedure and protocols and unfortunate circumstances, but Linda couldn't hear her over the sound of Sarah's monitor flattening, over the doctor shouting, "Clear!" and the terrible thump of the defibrillator, over the sound of her own heart breaking into pieces that would never fit back together again. And then Patricia said something that cut through the noise, something that made Linda's entire body go rigid. "Mrs. Bennett, I need you to understand that your daughter's condition was complicated by multiple factors, and any delay in treatment was due to the severity of other cases, not because of any algorithmic bias. If you make accusations without evidence, you could face legal consequences for defamation. The threat was delivered in the same sympathetic tone, wrapped in concern, presented as helpful advice. But Linda heard it for what it was. A warning. Stay quiet about what happened here, or we'll destroy you, the way we destroyed your daughter. Linda pulled her arm free from Patricia's grip and turned to face her. And something in Linda's expression made the risk management director take a step backward. You're threatening me while my daughter is dying 10 feet away. You're worried about defamation lawsuits while she's coding on that table because your system decided she wasn't worth saving. Linda's voice was quiet now, dangerously quiet. The kind of calm that comes after rage has burned through every other emotion and left only clarity behind. I want names. I want every person who saw her file tonight. Every person who knew she'd been assigned a room and chose not to put her in it. Every person who programmed that algorithm to flag families like mine. I want all of it, and I'm not leaving until I get it. Patricia's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something calculating underneath. Mrs. Bennett, I understand you're emotional, but you need to consider your position carefully. Making wild accusations in a moment of crisis, disrupting hospital operations, threatening staff, these actions have consequences. Your daughter's treatment is being documented by multiple witnesses, and I assure you that every decision made tonight will show that our team followed appropriate medical protocols. The implicit message was clear. They were already building the defense, already constructing the narrative that would protect the hospital when Sarah died. Because they knew she was going to die. They'd known it for hours, had probably known it the moment Linda walked through those doors with her complaint history flagged in their system. Sarah had been dead the moment the algorithm decided she was too expensive, too risky, too much trouble. Behind them, the sound of the defibrillator shocked through the air again, followed by tense silence. Then the doctor's voice. I've got a rhythm. Weak, but it's there. Linda spun around, hope flaring in her chest like a match struck in darkness. Through the doorway, she could see Sarah's monitor showing a heartbeat, erratic and fragile but present. Real. Proof that her daughter was still fighting. She pushed past Patricia and back into the room, back to Sarah's side, and grabbed her daughter's hand. The skin was cold. Too cold. But there was a pulse beneath Linda's fingers. Faint as a whisper, but undeniable. Sarah, baby, I'm here. You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. The words were as much prayer as promise. The doctor was already shaking his head, his face grim as he studied the monitors. We got her back, but she's unstable. The prolonged hypoxia caused significant damage. We need to intubate and get her to ICU immediately. Run a full cardiac panel. Assess neurological function. He paused, his eyes meeting Linda's with something that looked like guilt. Mrs. Bennett, you need to prepare yourself. Even if we stabilize her, the delay in treatment. He stopped, choosing his words carefully. There may be permanent complications. Permanent complications. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Heart damage. Organ failure. All the things that might have been prevented if Sarah had been treated when they arrived. If the algorithm hadn't decided her mother's history of asking questions made her expendable. Jessica appeared in the doorway, the young nurse who'd tried to warn Linda in the waiting room. And this time, she wasn't whispering. Dr. Mitchell, I need to speak with you. Now. The doctor looked annoyed, but stepped away from Sarah's bed, moving to the corner of the room where Jessica spoke in urgent, hushed tones. Linda couldn't hear the words, but she watched Dr. Mitchell's face change, watched his expression shift from irritation to shock to something that looked like horror. He glanced at Patricia, who was still standing in the doorway like a guard, then back at Jessica. Are you certain? Jessica nodded, her face pale but determined. I pulled the logs myself. I have screenshots. I'll lose my job for this, but someone needs to know. Dr. Mitchell turned to Patricia, and his voice carried across the room now, loud enough for everyone to hear. Patricia, Jessica is telling me that Sarah Bennett's file was manually overridden in the triage system. Someone with administrative access changed her priority coding from urgent to non-urgent 45 minutes after she arrived. That's not an algorithm. That's a person making a choice. The room went absolutely still. Patricia's professional composure cracked just for a second, and Linda saw naked panic flash across her face before the mask reassembled itself. That's a serious accusation, Jessica. I hope you understand the implications of what you're suggesting. But Jessica didn't back down. I understand perfectly. Someone in this hospital saw that Mrs. Bennett had filed a complaint history, saw that her daughter was presenting with cardiac symptoms, and decided to delay treatment hoping the problem would resolve itself or become someone else's responsibility. That's not risk management. That's medical murder. Medical murder. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to clear away, contaminating everything they touched. Linda felt her knees weaken, felt the full weight of understanding crash down on her. It wasn't just the algorithm. Someone had looked at Sarah's file, had seen a 19-year-old girl struggling to breathe, and had made the conscious decision to let her suffer. Had gambled with her life to protect the hospital from a potential lawsuit. Had chosen institutional reputation over human existence. And they'd almost gotten away with it. Would have gotten away with it if Jessica hadn't pulled those logs, if Linda hadn't forced her way into the ER, if Sarah's heart had stopped 5 minutes earlier. Patricia was already moving, pulling out her phone, speaking rapidly to someone on the other end. We have a situation in room 247. I need legal here immediately, and I need you to secure the triage system logs. Yes, right now. I don't care who you have to call. She ended the call and turned to Jessica with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jessica, I'm going to need you to come with me to discuss these allegations in a more appropriate setting. Making unfounded claims about colleagues is a violation of hospital policy. But Dr. Mitchell stepped between them. She's not going anywhere. If what she's saying is true, those logs are evidence of criminal negligence at minimum. And as the attending physician on this case, I'm mandated to report suspected negligence to the State Medical Board. He looked at Linda, and she saw something that had been missing in every other medical professional she'd encountered tonight. Genuine remorse. Mrs. Bennett, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to your daughter. Sarah's monitor began alarming again, the rhythm becoming chaotic, and suddenly they were back in crisis mode. Dr. Mitchell calling for medications, nurses moving with controlled urgency, and Linda being pushed aside once more as they fought to keep her daughter alive. But this time was different. This time Linda could see them trying, really trying, giving Sarah everything they had, instead of the bare minimum the algorithm had allocated. This time they were treating her like a human being instead of a liability, and Linda watched through tears as Sarah's heart rate stabilized again, as the monitors showed her daughter still hanging on, still fighting, and she realized with devastating clarity that this was how Sarah should have been treated from the beginning. This level of care, this urgency, this commitment to saving a life. It should have started the moment they walked through the hospital doors. The fact that it took a coding, a confrontation, and a whistleblower just to get basic emergency treatment was an indictment of everything the healthcare system had become. An older man in a white coat appeared in the doorway, his face flushed, his movements agitated. His name tag identified him as Dr. Raymond Chase, Chief of Emergency Medicine. He looked at Patricia, then at Dr. Mitchell, then at the room full of medical staff surrounding Sarah's bed. Someone want to tell me why I'm getting calls about manual override codes and triage logs? Dr. Mitchell didn't hesitate. Because someone in your department manually changed this patient's priority coding to delay her treatment, and she coded as a result. Jessica has the documentation. Dr. Chase's face went from flushed to pale. That's impossible. Manual overrides require my authorization code. I haven't. He stopped mid-sentence. his eyes going wide. "Oh, God! Patricia, tell me you didn't." Patricia's professional mask was gone now, replaced by cold calculation. "Raymond, we discussed this patient's case. You agreed the family's complaint history made immediate treatment inadvisable until we could assess the liability implications." Dr. Chase looked like he'd been punched. "I said we needed to review the file. I never authorized delaying emergency treatment. If you used my code to—" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Jesus Christ, Patricia, what have you done?" The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the same lights that had witnessed everything, as Linda sat beside Sarah's ICU bed 18 hours later. Her daughter was alive, breathing with the assistance of a ventilator, her heart rate steady on the monitors that surrounded her like electronic sentinels. But alive was a complicated word now. The neurologist had been kind but honest. The prolonged oxygen deprivation had caused damage, the extent of which they wouldn't know until Sarah woke up. If Sarah woke up, the words hung unspoken between every reassurance, every update, every carefully neutral medical term the doctors used to describe her daughter's condition. Linda hadn't slept, hadn't left Sarah's side except when forced to by medical procedures, hadn't stopped replaying every moment of the previous night, every decision and choice and crucial second that had been stolen from her daughter by people who thought in terms of liability instead of lives. The ICU nurse, a woman named Brenda with silver hair and kind eyes, brought Linda coffee and sat down in the chair beside her. "Your daughter's a fighter," Brenda said quietly. "I've been doing this 30 years, and I can always tell who's going to pull through. Sarah's got fight in her." Linda wanted to believe it, wanted to take comfort in Brenda's decades of experience and confident tone. But she'd learned something in that emergency room that she could never unlearn. Sometimes the system doesn't want you to fight. Sometimes it bets against you, stacks the odds, and roots for you to lose because winning would be expensive. The door opened and Detective Marcus Cole entered, his badge visible on his belt, his expression professionally sympathetic in the way that meant he'd seen too much tragedy to be shocked by one more. "Mrs. Bennett, I know this is difficult timing, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened last night." Linda straightened in her chair, her hand still holding Sarah's. "Jessica gave you the logs?" Detective Cole nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "She did. And we've also obtained testimony from Dr. Chase and several other staff members. Mrs. Bennett, what I'm about to tell you is part of an ongoing investigation, but I think you deserve to know." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Patricia Henderson has been systematically using Dr. Chase's administrative access codes to override triage decisions for the past 14 months. We've identified at least 47 cases where patients with complaint histories or previous litigation were either delayed treatment or transferred to other facilities. Your daughter's case is the first one that escalated to this level of crisis, but she wasn't the first patient to be targeted. 47 cases. 47 families who'd been punished for demanding accountability, for asking questions, for refusing to accept negligence quietly. Linda felt sick, imagining all those people sitting in waiting rooms, suffering in silence, being told their cases weren't urgent while Patricia Henderson played God with a stolen access code and a spreadsheet of grudges. "What happens now?" Linda asked, her voice hollow. Detective Cole's expression hardened. "Now we build a case for criminal negligence, possibly attempted manslaughter. Patricia's already lawyered up, claiming she was implementing hospital policy for risk management. Dr. Chase is cooperating fully, says he had no idea his codes were being used this way. The hospital is, predictably, trying to make this about one rogue employee rather than systemic issues." He looked at Sarah, then back at Linda. "But I've been doing this long enough to know that one person doesn't create a system like this alone. There were people who knew, people who looked the other way, people who benefited from those delays." The door opened again, and a woman in her 60s entered, wearing jeans and a sweater that looked expensive but understated. She had the air of someone used to being listened to, used to commanding rooms without raising her voice. "Mrs. Bennett, my name is Catherine Walsh. I'm an attorney who specializes in medical negligence and systemic health care abuse." She glanced at Detective Cole, who nodded and stood to leave, giving them privacy. Catherine sat down where the detective had been and pulled out a tablet. "Jessica contacted me this morning. She sent me copies of the triage logs, documentation of the override system, and a list of other patients she believes were similarly targeted. Mrs. Bennett, what happened to your daughter wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a coordinated effort to suppress complaints and punish patients who threatened the hospital's reputation." Linda stared at her, trying to process the implications. "You're saying other hospitals do this?" Catherine's expression was grim. "I'm saying that when you create systems that prioritize cost containment and liability reduction over patient care, you create incentives for exactly this kind of abuse. St. Catherine's might be more blatant about it, might have let it escalate further than most, but the underlying philosophy exists throughout the healthcare industry. Algorithms that determine treatment priority based on insurance coverage, risk assessment protocols that delay care for difficult patients, electronic health records that flag families with complaint histories. All of it serves the same purpose: protecting institutions from accountability." She leaned forward. "Your daughter is going to need extensive care, possibly for the rest of her life. The hospital will offer you a settlement, probably a substantial one, in exchange for your silence. I'm here to tell you that you have another option." Linda looked at Sarah's face, peaceful in artificial sleep, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. She thought about the other 47 cases, the other families who'd been punished for demanding better. She thought about her mother, dead from complications that never should have happened, and the complaint she'd filed that had marked her family for targeting. She thought about Patricia Henderson and her stolen access codes, about Dr. Chase, who'd been too busy to notice his authority being weaponized, about every nurse and administrator who'd seen the delays and done nothing. And she thought about the receptionist who'd looked at Sarah with pity, but not enough compassion to break the rules, about the security guard who'd finally helped, but only after Linda forced the issue, about Jessica, who'd risked everything to pull those logs and blow the whistle. "What's the other option?" Linda asked, though she already knew. Catherine smiled, and it was the smile of someone who'd been waiting to be asked that question. "We don't settle quietly. We take this public. We file suit not just against Patricia Henderson or St. Catherine's, but against the system that enabled this. We subpoena records from other hospitals. We demand investigations into algorithmic triage systems. We make so much noise that hospitals across the country have to confront what they've become. We turn your daughter's tragedy into the weapon that forces change." She paused. "It won't be easy. They'll attack your credibility, dig into your history, make you regret ever walking into my office. The hospital will spend millions on defense lawyers and PR firms. The medical establishment will close ranks. But we'll have the truth, and we'll have documentation, and we'll have Jessica's testimony. We might actually win." Linda squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling the warmth that meant her daughter was still here, still present, still fighting. If Sarah wakes up damaged because they delayed her treatment, she's going to have to live with that for the rest of her life. Other families shouldn't have to go through this. Other daughters shouldn't be left in waiting rooms to die because their mothers asked the wrong questions. She looked at Catherine, and her voice was steady now, certain. "I want to fight. Not for money. Not for revenge. I want to fight so that the next time a mother brings her daughter to an emergency room, she doesn't have to worry about algorithms and risk management and whether her family is on some blacklist. I want to fight so that hospitals remember they're supposed to save lives, not protect profit margins." Catherine nodded, already pulling out paperwork, already making calls, already transforming personal tragedy into legal strategy. And Linda sat there holding her daughter's hand, watching the monitors prove that Sarah was still alive, despite the system's best efforts to let her die. And she made a promise. Not to Sarah, who couldn't hear her. Not to the lawyers or detectives or whistleblowers, but to herself and to the 47 other families. And to every person who would walk into a hospital in the future not knowing they were entering a place where algorithms could decide their worth. She promised that St. Catherine's Medical Center had picked the wrong family to sacrifice on the altar of risk management. She promised that Patricia Henderson's stolen access codes and manual overrides would become Exhibit A in a case that would change healthcare policy. She promised that her daughter's suffering would not be meaningless, would not be forgotten, would not be buried under settlements and non-disclosure agreements. 3 days later, Sarah opened her eyes. The damage was real. Slower speech, memory gaps, motor control issues that would require months of therapy. But she was present, aware, herself in all the ways that mattered. And when she was strong enough to understand what had happened, when Linda explained about the algorithms and the delays and the 47 other families, Sarah didn't ask her mother to let it go. She didn't suggest settling quietly or moving on with their lives. She looked at Linda with eyes that had seen death and decided to come back anyway, and she said, "Let's make sure it never happens again." The lawsuit was filed 6 weeks later, and the story broke 3 days after that. News cameras outside St. Catherine's, reporters digging through triage logs, medical ethicists weighing in on algorithmic discrimination, patient advocacy groups rallying around the cause. Patricia Henderson was arrested. Dr. Chase resigned. The hospital's board launched an internal investigation that revealed the override system had been known to senior administrators who'd chosen not to intervene. And slowly, painfully, the national conversation began to shift. Hospitals in other states started reviewing their triage protocols. Legislators introduced bills requiring transparency in algorithmic healthcare decisions. Medical schools added ethics seminars on the dangers of prioritizing institutional protection over patient care. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to undo what had been done to Sarah, to give back the hours she'd lost in that waiting room or repair the damage to her brain. But it was something. It was 47 families getting apologies and acknowledgement. It was Jessica getting whistleblower protection and a new job at a hospital that valued integrity. It was other mothers bringing their daughters to emergency rooms and not having to wonder if their families were flagged in some database marked as too expensive, too risky, too much trouble to save. Linda stood in the courtroom 10 months later as the jury delivered their verdict. Negligence, systemic abuse, punitive damages in amounts that made the hospital's lawyers go pale. And she felt the weight of those waiting room hours finally begin to lift. Not disappear, never disappear, but lighten enough that she could breathe again, could imagine a future where Sarah's survival meant something beyond their personal tragedy. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the courthouse hallway as reporters shouted questions, and Catherine outlined their next steps, and Sarah stood beside her mother with one hand gripping a cane, and the other gripping Linda's arm for support. And Linda thought about that moment in the emergency room, that question that had formed when she'd realized the system had decided Sarah didn't matter. What if the system deciding who deserved care had already decided Sarah didn't matter? Now she had her answer. The system had decided exactly that, had marked her daughter as expendable, had gambled with her life, had nearly won. But Linda had refused to accept that verdict, had fought back with everything she had turned personal tragedy into public outrage and outrage into change. The system had decided Sarah didn't matter. Linda had proven them catastrophically wrong.